Welcome to Brite Divinity School's Borderland Institute Fall Webinar Series entitled Changing the Narrative, Changing Power, Framing Immigration Narratives. My name is Francisco Losada. I am the director of the Borderlands Institute at Brite Divinity School. It gives me great pleasure today to host this webinar series and to have with us Natalia Banulescu-Bogdan, Associate Director of the Migration Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. Before I introduce her, allow me to thank Rowena Tart, the Institute's Administrative Assistant, who is the backbone of putting this webinar series together. Also, I want to thank the Luce Foundation for the continuing support over the last several years, and particularly during the height of the global COVID pandemic. One more announcement, please join us for our next event, October 6th, with Dylan Corbett, Executive Director of the Hope Border Institute in El Paso, Texas. The title of his presentation is Displacing and Generative Narratives at the U.S.-Mexico Border. Registration will be available soon. Now, for those who were with us last fall, the webinar series aimed to bring awareness to the very complex issues around borderlands, with an eye toward the southern border of the U.S. Last year, we focused on various social factors that pertain to the unique political, social, and religious issues that impact the lives of people on the move. Building on the sharp and insightful remarks from our last year's speakers, whose recordings can be found on Brite's YouTube page, this year the Institute turned its attention upon how these factors are rooted in stories, narratives. For those who are engaged with sacred texts, it is well known that stories are laden with meaning, ethics, a point of view to persuade you to believe and do. Narratives convey values, construct representations, and communicate positive and negative assumptions and identities about people on the move, all of which influence our transformative social justice thinking and behaviors. Narratives tell us who we are and who we are not, and narratives challenge us to make change or perhaps no change at all. To get us started thinking about this assertion, we invited Natalia Banulescu-Bogdan, who has written and done research on the topic of migration narratives, to help us reflect more broadly about those questions surrounding migration narratives. Our hope today is to get you to think about what a narrative is and how it functions to shape how you see migrants and the marginalized, and how it works to reinforce empathy and compassion, but also works to create fear and danger. Our second hope is more praxis-oriented, that is, to inspire you to put those narratives in motion for liberative and transformative change for all. Natalia Banulescu-Bogdan is Associate Director of the Migration Policy Institute's International Program, where she is responsible for development and positioning of the new initiatives, oversight of research publications, and the overall strategic direction of MPI's international development, climate, and global governance work. Since joining MPI in 2008, Ms. Banulescu-Bogdan has also worked closely with MPI's flagship international initiative, the Transatlantic Council on Migration, through which she has helped advise stakeholders on various aspects of migration management and authored countless private policy memos for governments in Europe, North America, and beyond. Prior to joining MPI, she worked at the Brookings Institution. Ms. Banulescu-Bogdan obtained her master's in nationalism studies from the Central European University in Budapest, Hungary, where she wrote about the political mobilization of Roma in Romania. She received a bachelor's degree in international relations from the University of Pennsylvania. In her personal time, she manages an informal network of community volunteers supporting newly arrived refugees in Washington, D.C. and Maryland. Today's presentation is entitled, How We Talk About Migration, Narratives That Build Solidarity and Reduce Anxiety. So now join me in welcoming Ms. Banulescu-Bogdan to our virtual Brite Divinity School. I'm going to turn it now to Natalia.
Thank you so much, Francisco, for that very warm welcome. I'm really pleased to be here with all of you today and looking forward to the discussion. I'm going to start by taking you through a little bit of some of my recent research on narratives. And so I think Clayton's going to load the slides. Perfect. Thank you so much. First, I just want to start with, what are narratives when we're talking about the immigration space? How are they used? How are they formed? When we're faced with negative narratives, why is it so difficult to change people's minds once strong beliefs form? I'll touch on some of the recent public opinion trends to just sort of situate some of this in context, and then end with a few recommendations for how we can think about developing narratives that promote solidarity and a sort of evidence-based view of things, and that don't trigger resentment. So to jump right in, what are narratives? And I think Francisco already started us off a little bit. Narratives are basically built around stories. It's our way of interpreting or making sense of a world that is full of information, often full of competing pieces of information. And we have to find a way to sort of tease out a coherent storyline that helps us make sense of, what we're experiencing around us. And when we're talking about immigration, that this usually manifests along three different predominant frames that I want to introduce briefly. And we can talk later about how this is playing out in some of the headlines that we're all reading about these days. So essentially, migration narratives tend to fall into these three categories. There's the benefit or the hero frame, and this emphasizes the contributions that migrants can make to their receiving society, often highlighting exceptional talent. We've seen this during COVID, narratives about, emergency room doctors or nurses contributing to the emergency response. We see it when certain narratives lift up, tech entrepreneurs or exceptional sports stars. And there's a sort of drawback to this. It seems a bit counterintuitive because we're putting these positive messages into the world. But the problem is it can also introduce this dichotomy between quote unquote deserving and undeserving migrants, which of course can then backfire. So the idea is, if you are pinning a migrant's welcome on their actions or their contributions, in other words, if a welcome can be earned, it can also be taken away. The second category is what we can call the victim frame. So these are stories that are designed to elicit empathy, compassion, often highlighting the humanitarian needs of migrants, but also portraying them as vulnerable and in need of support. And the drawback to this framing is that it can reinforce stereotypes of migrants requiring more resources from a society than they're putting in. It can also remove perceptions of agency if it portrays newcomers as helpless, vulnerable. And it also is not necessarily durable. And we'll get into this a little bit later. But one of the things that I want to talk about is that asking people to be in this space of sacrifice and thinking of people in need of emergency support is not something that can be sustained for a very long time. The third frame we're all familiar with, which I'll call the villain frame or a threat frame. And this depicts immigrants as a burden, as a threat. Usually the threat is conceptualized along one of kind of four main axes. As an economic threat, that migrants take jobs or drive down wages, a security threat, depicting migrants as contributing to crime or threatening public order. Health, we've seen this, of course, through COVID, stories about migrants being a vector of communicable disease, and culture and identity. So the idea that newcomers' beliefs and practices are somehow incompatible with core national values, or they erode community culture. And so what I want to underscore here, having now presented these sort of rigid categories, is that they're not actually that rigid. It's not an either or when it comes to narratives. And it's kind of tempting to fall into this pattern, to reduce public opinion on migration to a sort of simple binary, for or against. You either support or oppose. But I would push back on this a little bit. I think the truth is that many different narratives coexist at once. I think we've seen this pretty clearly during the pandemic. You see, increasing anxiety around, people coming in, this temptation to clamp down borders, to close. At the same time, we've seen this outpouring of solidarity toward migrants and refugees, and quite creative and generous responses to displacement in many cases. And so there's never one story. I think most people are more likely to be ambivalent, to have conflicting attitudes rather than very strongly pro or anti-migration. And so if we accept this, this really changes how we need to think about how we respond to public anxiety, because it means that people can have pride and compassion for newcomers alongside genuine anxieties about how rapid social change is affecting their lives. And each of these can become more or less salient in different circumstances. And so, I guess I want to kind of erase this visual of a sort of linear progression, right, from pro all the way to anti, and instead introduce this sort of like messy visual of an ecosystem of multiple overlapping and sometimes contradictory stories about migration that is a lot messier. And so I just want to put this into context a little bit and talk about what we know about key trends in public opinion in the United States, but also all over the world. As a researcher, and I think some of us on this call are also advocates, or also thinking about research, humanitarian response. It's really important to understand when and how different strands of anxieties become dominant, and why certain messages resonate and others don't. So what do we know about how negative narratives on migration take hold and spread? I would start by saying that public attitudes are not necessarily becoming more negative overall. Sometimes, we see these headlines that people are becoming, increasingly more negative, that policies are, going in the direction of more restrictive. And I don't think that's exactly true across the board. The story is much more nuanced. But it's important to understand that negative sentiment is clustered in certain parts of the world and under certain circumstances. And so just throwing a couple of polls on the screen for you to see. So the first is the Gallup Migrant Acceptance Index, which compared public opinion between 2016 and 2019. And when these headlines came out right before the pandemic hit, people said, oh, wow, public opinion is really trending in this very negative direction in a lot of places in the world. But actually, if you look more closely, you see some clear stories emerge from this. And first of all, it shows that negative attitudes are concentrated in some of the countries that are hosting the majority of the world's migrants and refugees. So we can see, for instance, Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador at the very top of this list, showing the sharpest declines in migrant acceptance of all countries surveyed. Now, these, of course, are the top 3 host countries of Venezuelans. You can see, a similar result when you look at the top host countries of Syrian refugees. So this Pew survey on the right looks at how people feel about diversity, and it finds similar evidence of sort of declining support in Lebanon and Jordan, which host the second and third largest populations of Syrian refugees. And so what does this tell us? The first thing is that even the strongest expressions of solidarity don't last forever. We see very clearly that support for displaced populations tends to wane over time, especially as crises wear on. We sometimes refer to this as hospitality fatigue. So again, going back to this question about the durability and the usefulness of the victim or the humanitarian frame. And we see that after the emergency phase of a crisis, practical concerns about the future really begin to dominate. Whether immigrants are able to find jobs and become self-sufficient, whether newcomers are integrating well or living parallel lives, and that these concerns can become prominent even in places that have seen, extraordinary short-term solidarity, even on cultural or political grounds. So again, also looking at what's happening with Ukrainians right now in Europe, and thinking about, how long the spirit of welcome is likely to last. And here's just an example from the European migration and refugee crisis in 2014, 2015, which shows a similar story. The other piece of this is that perceptions around fairness and deservedness also really drive tensions around migration. And so in places where risks and burdens have fallen unequally or perceived to have fallen unequally, where people think that newcomers are getting more than they're putting in, are sort of gaming the system, solidarity might dissipate more quickly, and publics might feel like they've been taken advantage of. And so, even when we're talking about refugees, which we tend to think of as some of the populations that elicit the most empathy, there are these, you start to see some sort of cracks in whether people think that they're really genuine refugees, or again, are somehow taking advantage of the system. So this idea of fairness, we see it with access to public benefits as well, really drives some of these negative sentiments. The way flows are managed is also very, very important. So this perception that things are out of control or there's no end in sight can be highly destabilizing. And so, if we think about reactions to flows across the southern border in the United States, this is a classic example. We saw, for example, back in 2014, the crisis around unaccompanied minors. When you look at the absolute numbers, we're not talking about a large number of people. We're talking about numbers in the tens of thousands. When you compare this to places that have seen influxes of millions, it's hard to correlate the strength of the reaction to the scale or the volume of flows. And so again, how flows are managed, how they're messaged, whether things appear chaotic or out of control is one of the explanations for why even small flows can spike these kinds of fears and tensions, and how sometimes much, much larger flows don't have the same effect. And so finally, sometimes there's a sort of tipping point, or what I sometimes refer to as a threshold question, where I think people can sort of accommodate a certain amount of change before they start to have existential fears about what this change means in their life. And so often when we see very strong reactions to migration, it's because there's a fear that migrants will become dominant, that they're going to somehow irrevocably change the fundamental character of society, whether that's through outsized cultural, religious, linguistic, or political influence. The fears in the US that are sometimes expressed by politicians and others, media, that the country is going to become majority minority, and what will that mean? We see this expressed in a political way in countries that have a power sharing arrangement among different ethnic groups. So in Lebanon, for instance, that has welcomed a lot of Syrians, there are these really acute fears that it's going to change the power balance in the country. And so I think these fears also become particularly acute when change is very visible. Also, if we think about fears around Muslim immigrants in Western Europe, for instance, and the sort of visible changes of, thinking about introducing a mosque in a small community. And also when the host community feels that they haven't been consulted, they haven't had any control or agency over these changes. And so I've tried to kind of paint a picture of, how narratives can get pulled into this place of existential fear, of panic, of deep anxiety. And once that happens, it can be quite difficult to turn things around. And so I just take a few minutes to go through some of the research I've done on why it's so difficult to change people's minds. So, I hope I've already kind of started to make the case for why I don't think that simply inserting positive stories into the debate is necessarily a good rebuttal to some of these fears and some of these negative narratives. There are a couple different challenges. One is the proliferation of information. So every possible message about migration is already out in the world. And people need to make sense of this chaotic information landscape. So one way they make sense of this is limiting what information they consume. We go into echo chambers. We ignore things that we don't want to engage with. We dismiss things that don't reinforce what we already believe. And so these are psychological tricks that the human mind employs. And it's a real, defense mechanism. We have to make sense of what is happening. And we revert to certain shortcuts to do that. One of our shortcuts is using our social circles as a proxy for what information to trust. So no matter how persuasive your message is, it's very hard to penetrate people's defenses once they already have strong beliefs in place, unless somebody from within their trusted social circle tells them to believe it, gives them permission to change their mind. So, often it's really about the messenger rather than the message when it comes to why we believe certain things over others. The second problem is that once beliefs are formed, they're highly resistant to corrections. So, our brains kind of do this mental gymnastics when we're faced with information that contradicts or challenges our existing beliefs. And I would ask everybody to kind of be honest with themselves and think about how you consume information and whether or not you also participate in this kind of confirmation bias, because I think it's quite powerful and we all do it. And so if we don't just dismiss things out of hand, if we actually accept a new piece of information, we don't let it change our worldview. And so what happens is we often rationalize new evidence as the exception to the rule. So, I think that, immigrants are bad for the economy, or they drive up crime, and you show me, well, actually, 1,000 refugee doctors actually contributed in a really important way during the, COVID response. I could say, okay, I believe that, but it was the exception. It doesn't change this pattern that I think is pretty set in how immigration overall affects the country. So it, even when messages get through, they have trouble sort of dislodging the larger storyline that people have committed to. And then the last thing is we can't really control how people interpret information. And so I call this the kind of the demand and supply imbalance. So I think sometimes when we're trying to promote positive narratives or stories, we are so focused on the information that we want to convey and much less on how it's likely to be received. And so one issue is that positive messages or overly positive messages can also generate resentment. So, stories that talk only about the benefits of migration, or, messages that ask people to have compassion for newcomers, sometimes without acknowledging the real challenges that other people are facing, especially, at a time when we've all just gone through this global public health crisis. Many people feel disadvantaged in their lives, feel like their own life opportunities have been curtailed. Sometimes it's really difficult to ask people to have compassion for other groups when they feel like their own struggles and concerns aren't being heard. And so, this reliance on compassion can be tricky. It's a tricky instrument. Sometimes it can be effective in the early stages of crisis. So this durability issue that I referred to earlier, but backfire once a sort of crisis fatigue has set in, or again, when a host community's circumstances worsen somehow, and that's when it can actually backfire. And so, again, the issue is not that there's an absence of information on migration. The issue is that there's actually a chaotic information landscape. And we can't actually control what people decide to believe or prioritize. And so what do we do? So what do we do in this situation? Have a couple of recommendations, but I'll be brief so we can have more of a discussion around this. I would start by saying we need to kind of move away from trying to change people's attitudes. We can't tell people that they have to have compassion toward others, that there's a benefit toward migration. They have to see that for themselves. It has to be real in their own lives. And that's going to be much more effective than any message that they can read or see on TV or in the news. I also think we need to invoke pragmatism rather than compassion. And so this is a related point. You can't always resolve people's practical concerns about the future with an appeal to values. And I think with immigration, there are a lot of legitimate fears and questions that people have. There are many different ways to manage migration, many choices to be made, and people want to feel like they have a say in those choices. And we also need to find ways to, again, kind of invoke people's own interests. solidarity with migration should be seen as something that's essential to furthering every community's own goals, including economic goals, not something that's imposed upon people. And then finally, I would recommend thinking about what underlies people's concerns about migration, and what underlies some of the even unpleasant things, unpleasant sides to this anxiety that we've seen, including explicit xenophobia. So I think sometimes what we miss when we talk about combating xenophobia is that people do have some real concerns. You know, often there's a kernel of a real concern that drives feelings of insecurity, and which then can manifest in some undesirable ways, for instance, scapegoating migrants or, you know, discrimination. But we can't solve this problem by only addressing how the anxiety is manifesting. We actually have to go underneath to the roots of people's concerns. Like, are people worried that their own children don't have adequate life opportunities? Are people worried that, you know, the rule of law is breaking down? Even when we don't agree with what is driving people's concerns, we have to do a better job of trying to understand what is driving them. People have different values systems, and almost everybody taps into a value system when they're reacting to something like immigration. So we have to understand what are the value systems that are driving, you know, even some of the most unsavory reactions to immigration. And I'll just stop there and just look forward to some questions and discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natalia. Let me begin with several questions, and then we can open it up for the public. Yeah, I mean, I think you gave us a lot of things to think about, particularly that last slide around the recommendations. Can you say a little bit more about, is it the way it was sort of put was pragmatism instead of compassion? Can you say a little bit more about why couldn't it be both?
Right. I mean, it can be both, and nothing is ever just one or the other. But again, I think that sometimes, you know, when we go out into the world, we're so rooted in our own value system, in what makes us tick, in, you know, what is the most important part of our humanity and our approach to the world, that sometimes this blocks out what motivates and drives other people. And there's been a lot of interesting research in public opinion on migration that tries to segment different attitudes that you can see at a population level by values orientation. So instead of thinking about different groups of people based on demographics, like old people or highly educated people, gender, you can actually carve out different groups of attitudes, different attitude orientations based on values. So whether people have a more conservative value set or value orientation, you know, whether people really value authority, loyalty, whether people value compassion, openness. There are many different kinds of values orientation, and we have to understand what motivates people who have different views. So I, you know, telling people that their views are wrong will backfire 100%. We have to instead understand what underlies those views, what gives rise to them, what feeds them and gives them oxygen. And you know, I think relying on compassion is not always going to be sufficient. I think we see this right now in places like Texas, where, you know, the governor is making a really big bet that people care more about law and order and fairness than they do about the humanitarian condition of individuals. He's making that bet and saying we can no longer tolerate the incursions on our, you know, on this lawful society, on law and order, on good management of our border. And we have to do something really desperate. So he's, it's a political calculation, but I think it's that most of us, I think, probably see as quite cynical. Really using vulnerable people as pawns in a political game. But I think if we look at the frames that I presented, in this conversation, you can see, how he's basically making this calculation and betting that a lot of people will find appealing this this sort of play to, we need to have a better sense of order and address kind of the chaos and poor management of migration and borders.
Yeah. I think there's some, as you know, I've told you a little bit about Brite and our ideas, values, and whatnot. When we're at a very progressive school like Brite is, there is an assumption, even within the compassionate approach, if you want to put it that way, using compassion as a way to move people to think differently about migrants and to do different things. The one element that sometimes, I think what I like about your presentation is that it shows complexity, that no matter whether you're on, wherever your political position is, or wherever you are theologically on these questions, that you can find people at different narratives within the progressive camp or the conservative camp. For the sake of discussion, we'll use that for now. It gets, what I see gets really sort of interesting, particularly within the progressive sort of context, is when race enters in the picture, or sexuality formations sometimes. And so your presentation came to mind on the anxiety element when Haitians were at the border, how the narrative changed a bit, at least in my sort of viewing of things. Have you seen, is there, my direct question is, how does race, ethnicity sort of play into the anxiety? Does it play differently across the globe, or on the US-Mexico border?
I think that's a fascinating question, and it absolutely plays into it. And you don't even have to look so far as comparing the reactions to different migrant groups. You can also look even within one group. So, thinking about Venezuelans in South America, thinking about Central Americans in the United States, you see very different reactions to different waves of people that have come at different times, people that have come under slightly different circumstances and are perceived as lower or higher skilled, having entered illegally or lawfully. And all of these things make a huge difference in terms of how people are perceived as a threat or not, and along what dimensions are they perceived as a threat. And so I think sometimes race can be used as a proxy for different kinds of threat. So the perception that certain minorities, visibly different religious or ethnic minorities, or more low educated people, or people who came unlawfully, are more likely to contribute to crime, for instance. You see that as a very pervasive stereotype. And so I think sometimes you see these different characteristics of migrant populations kind of linked to different prejudices, different threat perceptions. But I think what's interesting is that it also can change. And so even within one group, as I said, you can have an initial response of solidarity, an initial very favorable response. We see this with Syrians, in Europe as well as in the Middle East. And then as the crisis wears on, as people's own life circumstances get worse, they start to perceive a threat where they hadn't initially seen one. There's some interesting public opinion polling on Syrians, for instance, where over time, people have started to perceive them as less culturally similar to Turks than they did at the beginning of the crisis. Turkey, of course, hosting the largest number of Syrians in the world. And so that's quite, I think, an interesting finding that shows that, people hold all of these conflicting views at one time, but different circumstances will activate different fears, will have them kind of rise in importance as other ones ebb. And so I think that's, part of the issue that we're grappling with here. Things like race or socioeconomic status can be weaponized at different times. It's not always organic that people attach them to certain prejudices. Sometimes that's done for them, and it sticks. But the situation is quite fluid, and people care about different things at different times, right? So sometimes, the predominant concern is about jobs and wages. Sometimes COVID happens, and all of a sudden, the predominant concern is actually about communicable disease in certain places, particularly, in border areas. We saw that really spike up during the pandemic. And sometimes, it's about crime and, in general disorder. And so, it's never just one thing. But I think you're right. We have to think about, what are some of the characteristics of migrant populations that are used to drum up a sense of threat, whether that is because of sort of passive prejudices that have been passed down over generations, or whether that's because it's been sort of actively orchestrated by politicians.
Yeah. And I would just throw in there, sometimes it also involves preachers and ministers and whatnot. So they also part of that sort of infrastructure of information as well. So I think you hit on a lot of what many of our students are dealing with right now. They're the conflicting values within their respective congregations. So I think this has been very helpful in helping us think through some of this. I'm going to turn it now to some questions that people have submitted, if that's okay, and then we can move from there. Let's see. Can you see that question? This is where no. Okay. Natalia, can you see the question or no?
Yes. Do you want me to just jump in?
Yeah, I can read it and then.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not sure if everyone can see questions or.
I'm sorry. Okay, that's correct. This concept of values orientation is fascinating. In coming to understand it better, is there a way to factor in the way a single individual may have seemingly conflicting values?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think individuals always have conflicting values and, stories that they might believe. And so, you might at the same time feel like it's very important to show compassion to people in a vulnerable position, but at the same time feel a strong sense of loyalty to family and community. And sometimes these things either are in conflict or are portrayed as being in conflict. And I think, again, one way to understand it is not just that people believe one thing or another all the time, but that certain beliefs and certain narratives rise in importance at different times over others. And, so there are lots of different reasons for why this might ebb and flow. So a crisis situation, for example, might sort of raise the sort of humanitarian impulses higher on the agenda for a certain period of time, but then economic issues might rise in importance again once the sort of immediate emergency phase of the crisis recedes. I think we have to grapple with this, that people do have conflicting values, that people believe conflicting truths about migration, and that's actually normal. That's not the exception. I think we all have different concerns and anxieties that kind of come to the surface at different times. But what I do think is helpful is understanding what might be most important to people at different times. So again, understanding that people who are very motivated by authority and loyalty as a values orientation might see spikes in crime as something that they can't get over. And so appealing to them on the basis of compassion is like ships, passing each other in the night. It doesn't address their primary concern. And so I think that's one of the issues. We have to kind of see what drives people and meet them where they are.
Okay. Let me turn to the second, another question. Do you think that this kind of behavior can be seen within migrant communities? For example, Mexican migrants who have been established within the US for many years, reacting to Central Americans arriving, and I might add Haitians arriving. I've known people who have voiced resentment and worry in a political and economic line regarding policy changes in immigration and job searches.
Oh, absolutely. I think there's actually a sort of classical or classic sociological explanation for this, which is that if people feel like their status as a group is precarious in any way, they're much less likely to be generous toward other groups. So basically, the lower you feel you are on the totem pole in the United States or another country, the less likely you are to advocate for kind of widening the fold and bringing more people in. And so that's actually a common thing that we see, that recently arrived immigrants are the first to say we should have more restrictions in certain parts of immigration policy. And it comes out of a place of insecurity because they worry about, the sort of meager gains that they've had to work so hard to make. Whereas somebody, much more established, in their position in the United States, and who feel like maybe their kids, future is secured, et cetera, might have more space to be generous, to kind of opening the tent toward others.
Okay. Thank you. Let's turn to another question. Drama occurs when you use a framework such as a hero, the victim, and the villain. What are the ways in which drama affects immigration and prevents immigrants from taking responsibility for their situation? Does political gain influence the cultivation of drama?
I'm not entirely sure I understand this question.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure if somebody was asking about or what aspect of immigrants taking responsibility for their situation, if that's more about sort of agency, or if that's about, do people have a responsibility to contribute to the host society. So I might need to ask a follow-up on that one. I'm not quite sure what the
it's a little, I wasn't, and reading it now, it's a little bit more, a little bit more follow-up would be helpful here. Let's turn to another question here. I think you may see, okay, yes. I appreciate the concept of complexity and needing to see that there is chaotic information landscape which folks are trying to navigate. People are bringing their values and experience to bear on their opinions about immigration. While living along the Texas-Mexico border, I was surprised to hear negative opinions about immigrants from second-generation immigrants. I wonder whether these border towns are experiencing more hospitality fatigue.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of interesting strands in here. So first, just that people, places have very different experiences of immigration, right? There's a difference
Mhm.
to how capital cities or, big magnet cities um, experience immigration, where they have more resources, more infrastructure, more jobs, versus border towns that experience this sort of constant flux, that are sort of on the front lines of response, that don't always feel like they have support from capitals, from the national level, to sort of confront the reality that they're living, all the way to rural areas that might not have much experience with immigration at all, and could be confronted by a sudden influx that they're totally unprepared for. So I think it is important to think about the different experiences of immigration that big metropolitan areas might have versus rural areas versus border towns. And this issue of hospitality fatigue is also important, because I think when places are on the front lines of immigration, and it's where people are first coming in, where they need that, the sort of humanitarian response, and sometimes that conflicts with the sort of policy response. They might feel like they're not getting the resources that they need, to fully manage the sort of responsibilities that they have. And this isn't unique to the United States. I mean, you see these same debates in Europe, for example, around solidarity, between the kind of frontline states that receive most of the migrants who make sea crossings, for example, so Greece and Italy, versus some of the countries that have strong labor markets, like Germany and Sweden, where a lot of migrants end up and where they want to go and settle. And you sort of see a parallel to that a little bit with what the governor of Texas is trying to do, again, and a quite cynical way. And I know that some folks have asked about this in the chat as well, where he's basically saying, why should Southern states bear the burden of this migration? This is his argument that he's making. The sanctuary states that welcome migration should actually be the ones that are on the front lines for a change. Definitely not making any argument about the validity of this response or the humanity of this response. But I think it is interesting from a narratives perspective, that he's really trying to tap in to this sense of unfairness, of we're doing more than our fair share and we're not getting the support that we need. So I think that's actually a powerful undercurrent of people, of this, fatigue of people, in places that have seen a lot of churn from immigration, feeling like they aren't well enough supported in this. And then just to address the other part of this question about negative opinions from second generation immigrants, and we touched upon this a moment ago. I think that this is in many ways a natural response. In addition to the sense of precarity that many children of immigrants and immigrants themselves might feel, there's an additional, again, element of fairness of, there's a bit of a mythology that happens, right? Well, my family had to work so hard to come here, or we came legally, therefore other people should have to work just as hard and follow the same legal channels. I see that a lot in different immigrant communities. So the sense of, it's unfair, if we had to make certain sacrifices and they feel like others are taking advantage or gaming the system. But two, this fear that that the actions of certain immigrant populations will reflect poorly on immigrants as a whole. And I think, especially since, Latino immigrants often get sort of grouped together, regardless of where they're from, when they came, what their circumstances are. So I think there is a little bit of this fear of a spillover effect of, if certain migrants come in irregularly and, don't follow the law, then I could experience discrimination as a second generation immigrant, who's a visible minority, for instance. So I think all of these things are kind of factoring in.
How much do you think and I'm sort of maybe moving the discussion a little differently, but how much does just knowing history and the history of migrants in the U.S. and the immigration play a role in shaping narrative and also shaping the way people think of migrants or people who are arriving from different places?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's not just knowing history, but it's the way that history is told. So again, it's the storytelling around it. There's a lot, all countries have myths. We all have our foundational myths. Things get exaggerated or put in a different light, or, certain groups are depicted as heroes and others as villains. And so it's very difficult to combat that mythologizing with any kind of sort of data or textbooks. So it's not enough for people to be taught a different history. I think that different history also has to filter down from the top. It has to, it has to change how stories are told about what makes the country great, about, the different role that different groups have played over time. And so I think if you can't change that storytelling or the mythology around a country's foundational story or myth, there's sort of some limitations to what you can achieve through textbooks or, by kind of injecting more data into the debate.
Right. Yeah. What I see a lot with a clash at times as a Catholic, you can have Pope Francis provide a phenomenal rereading of the story of the Good Samaritan at one end, but then go to a certain suburban Catholic parish and hear that reading of a Good Samaritan being trumped by, for example, the fear of security.
Yeah.
And so so I wonder at times if it's more than just a leader. It has to be something more than that. And I think you sort of pointed to this a little bit about how it needs to be real in people's lives. But anyway, your response got me thinking a little bit about my own particular context.
No, I think that's a really powerful and concrete example. And again, I think people can't just be told that compassion is important. It certainly is helpful that message comes from a beloved, trusted figure within people's in kind of important identity circles. But I think that's still not enough when it comes up against, as you say, practical concerns and fears that people have. And so I think we have to do both. We have to address people's fears while also kind of cultivating the value around welcoming people.
Thank you, Natalia. I think we've reached the end of our webinar here, and I wanted to again thank the audience who were present and with very stimulating questions here for Natalia. And I hope there's a lot of information here for us to continue thinking about. Just a quick reminder again, October 6th, our second speaker is Dylan Corbett, Executive Director of the Hope Border Institute, Displacing and Generative Narratives at the U.S.-Mexico Border. At this time, let's give Natalia our sort of virtual online hand of applause here for her work. Thank you.
Thank you so much.